me help you know us a little better. The National Council of Jewish Women is a grassroots organization of volunteers who advocate to turn progressive ideas into action. We are inspired by Jewish values, whether we're Jewish or not. We strive for social justice by improving the quality of life for women, children, and families, and by safeguarding individual rights and freedoms. We work on behalf of the following priorities: advancing the well-being and status of women, advancing the well-being of children and families, enhancing the quality of Jewish life, ensure and advance the civil rights and individual rights of all people, support a secure Israel and the well-being of all of its people. At the end of this event, if you like what you hear and you like what you see, perhaps you'd like to join us. There are envelopes on your chairs, there are envelopes outside, and you might decide this is the organization for you. You will also find on your chair evaluations. Please take a minute to fill them out, because your opinion is very important to us. Before I introduce our wonderful panel of speakers, I'd like to thank Ruth Williams. Ruth, in the back. She is our Director of Advocacy, and we could never do any of these programs without all of her hard work. In the audience, I think, where's Hillary? Is she here? Well, our Executive Director, Hillary Selvin, is here. Our co-president, Ruth Seitzu, is up here, and after this conversation that we're having is over, if you'd like to ask some questions about the council, please feel free to come up and talk with us. For those of you who are not aware of it, October is Domestic Violence Month. And this was established 23 years ago in October 1987. We have come a long way, but we certainly have a long way to go. And statistics indicate that domestic violence is still quite prevalent, and actually reported instances are climbing. And I think this is because at one time nobody talked about it, and now people are being given permission to talk about it. I thought I was pretty well educated on domestic violence, sexual predators, because I've watched Law and Order SVU since it started. But when I started reading about what these people here on the panel have done and the kind of work that they do, I realized I really need to be re-educated. So I'm going to quote Robin, because she made a statement that said, "So for October, it is truly so important that we come together to recognize that protecting ourselves and our kids starts with us. We can't really rely on someone else. We really have to start keeping our eyes and our ears open." For those of you who don't know Robin Sack, she is a member of the California State Bar and a practicing attorney, and she is also a TV legal commentator. Our other panelists are Adrienne Mitchell. Where are you, Adrienne? Here you are. She is a special agent with the FBI. My mother told me to stay away from FBI people. She is currently assigned to the Los Angeles Division, and she has for 8 years been on the Southern California Regional Sexual Assault Team. Esther Maya Paredes, Esther, is a detective in the juvenile division of the Abused Children section and has worked with the Los Angeles Police Department for 17 years. And certainly, last but not least, where are you, Jan? I missed you. Well, Jan's missing. So I know that Jan is Yeah, thank you. Jen, this is Dr. Jen Berman, and she is a marriage, family, and child therapist in private practice in Los Angeles. She has appeared as a psychological expert on the Oprah Winfrey Show, on the Tyra Banks Show, but basically she helps people move from the role of victim to the role of survivor, and that is a critical role that we all want. And of course, our moderator, who is David Ono, and David Ono is the co-anchor for ABC 7 Eyewitness News at 4 and 6, and like I introduced him to the panel, and I said, and here is our one good-looking man. He can read the teleprompter, and he's actually been out in the trenches doing all the work that anchors and reporters need to do. And David is going to moderate this, and so I'm going to turn it over to David.
Thank you. And we actually get, in my opinion, some really great work done. This panel obviously is very well versed in the subject matter we're dealing with today. It's a very complex subject matter that can go in so many different directions. The fact that you guys are here shows that you have a tremendous amount of interest in this, and what you're going to learn today could not only help you, could help your family, could help your friends, etc. So listen carefully. We're going to eventually open up to questions. I think we're going to allow you to write your questions down. You're going to pass them forward. I will eventually get them and get to as many as possible. We'll try to get to that around 1 o'clock this afternoon. You just heard about our panelists, and we're going to meet them in 1 second, but I was looking over some information on the internet to research this topic, and as a result, I came across the California Department of Justice's website. And this website, which you can all investigate on your own as well, gives you kind of an overlay of what we are dealing with here in the state of California. And they tell us that there are 63,000 people registered as sex offenders here in the state of California. And that's just the ones that we know about that have been prosecuted. There are so many more out there. Obviously, this is a pervasive problem, and that it could hit anybody at any time, in almost any situation. We also know where 33,500 of these offenders basically are living within our communities throughout California, but that only basically accounts for half of the registered sex offenders that we know of. I ran across another article that says that because of all the restrictions that we're putting on registered sex offenders and where they can live, many of them are now homeless and therefore basically lost in various cities and left to do whatever they will do because people are not watching what they're doing because we can't keep up with them. There are so many different ways that a sex offender can strike. Children, in particular, it's a very high-profile crime. You see it in the news all the time. I think recently we've seen cases like Chelsea King and Amber Dubois. John Gardner was a predator who raped and killed them. That's been in the news a lot lately. We've seen Polly Klaas, obviously from the early 90s. J.C. Dugard, who was recently discovered still alive, even though she was kidnapped back in 1991. Thankfully still alive, but very much a victim of this. And we saw most recently Rodney Alcala, a serial killer, sex offender, finally go to prison for crimes that he did back in the 1970s, and now he is sitting on death row. These are just a very few cases that are in the news these days, but it's the very tip of the iceberg of what is happening out there. And it's not just to children, it's to adults as well. Each person in this room could potentially be a victim of these kinds of crime. All right, so let's meet our panelists right now. You've heard a little bit about what they do. I'm going to give them about a minute or so to kind of give you some of their thoughts on where their expertise lies and their experience. If they could sum that down to 60 seconds, their whole life's work. Okay? Let's start with Dr. Jen Berman. And Doctor, I know that she has laryngitis, so listen carefully.
I hope you can hear me okay. 60 seconds or less, my whole career. Okay, here we go. I started out my career working for the Los Angeles Commission on Assaults Against Women as a rape and battering hotline counselor. And while I spent a couple of years there, I also did accompaniment to people who had been raped, and I trained hundreds of women to do hotline counseling as well. I'm in private practice as a psychotherapist, and I've seen many survivors in my practice. I also have written 2 books, both back there. And and the A to Z Guide to Raising Happy, Confident Kids. It talks about some of these issues. And then another book geared towards the first 3 years, which is Super Baby, 12 Ways to Give Your Child a Head Start in the First 3 Years. I also have a radio show, and I'm on TV quite a bit. So
Great.
That's me in a nutshell.
Excellent. Detective Esther Reyes with the LAPD.
Hi everyone, I am working out of Juvenile Division downtown, but I have an office at the Stewart House in Santa Monica. The Stewart House is a multidisciplinary team which encompasses prosecutors, law enforcement, Department of Children and Family Services, therapists. We all work together to protect children. It's kind of like a one-stop shopping for children. We take in the victims, we do one interview with everyone present so the victim isn't constantly being asked different questions and re-traumatized during this whole process. So it's very children-oriented. There's volunteers there that play with the children before they even talk to us to get rid of any anxiety issues, to kind of bring the children back to being children for a while, and then they get to talk to an advocate, and then they get to talk to and then we do the interview. So it's kind of all of us working together to investigate these allegations of sexual abuse.
Great. Robin Sachs.
Hi, my name is Robin Sachs. I also worked, and I say that in past tense because I was a prosecutor for the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office. I was there for 10 years. The last 7 years I spent at Stewart House with Detective Reyes and working on as the DA member of the multidisciplinary team. I found that in the DA's office that every day I would go to court and there would be empty courtrooms, and I would watch and see all of these cases play out in front of a judge and a jury, yet the secrets stayed behind closed doors. So I decided that instead of justice being dispensed one jury at a time, one victim at a time, that I was going to use my God-given big mouth and get out there and write, talk, and educate on these issues, because it's one thing to deal with seeking justice after a crime has been committed, but it is much more effective to try to utilize other means to effectuate justice. So I've totally exploited myself and the media in every possible way I possibly can to be able to advocate on behalf of victims.
Great. So there are positives to exploiting yourself. Special Agent Adrian Mitchell.
My name is Adrian Mitchell. I'm an agent for the FBI, as mentioned before. I'm assigned to a multi-agency task force known as the SAFE Team. It stands for the Sexual Assault Felony Enforcement Team. Our main mission is to investigate crimes against children. The majority of the cases that we investigate involve the internet, so individuals that are enticing or forcing minors into a sexual relationship, or cases involving child pornography. I've been there for about 8 years, and prior to that was a juvenile probation officer in the state of Indiana. I avoid the media as much as possible, unlike the rest of the panelists.
Great. I'm going to start things off with a very generic question to each one of our panelists, and they can be in agreement with each other. Just one line here, but if I was to ask you, what is the one point that you would like these audience members to take home with them today, starting with Dr. Jen? What would you say that was?
I would say trust your gut instinct.
Trust your gut instinct. Detective Reyes?
I would say that I know a lot of people watch Law and Order and TV shows. DNA does not get handled in half an hour.
That is a great point. That's been in the news
Cases
a lot
are not
lately,
solved
too.
in half an hour in the real world. So
Oh,
just
yeah.
have patience with us.
That's a really good point, because we've done stories about how sometimes it takes years, and some have not been tested at all. Robin Sachs.
The most important message I would want to get is to report. I think that so long as we start reporting, whether or not we think it's prosecutable or not, convictable or not, it's our duty and responsibility on behalf of not only ourselves, but on behalf of everybody else to make sure the perpetrators are known and that they are reported.
Great. And Special Agent Mitchell.
I think I would kind of piggyback on what Dr. Jen and Robin said, and that's listen to your children. If you listen to it, or if a child makes an outcry to you that something bad is happening, listen to them, do not brush it off, pay attention.
Great. Let's start off with a conversation with Robin Sachs. You were telling me that you have some experience with the Amber Dubois case, which was in the news recently. Was it Amber Dubois or
Yeah.
Chelsea King? Amber Dubois. Both of them, okay. And to refresh your memory, that's when this was in the news recently. John Gardner apparently killed both of them, Chelsea King and Amber Dubois, and he was already a registered sex offender. And so we learned a lot of really tough lessons on this case. What can you give us?
Well, first of all, just to In full disclosure, I am the attorney representing the Amber Dubois family. I filed a lawsuit on behalf of the Dubois family against parole, very similarly to what the Dugards did, or excuse me, what JC's family did in suing parole for the Garrido case. What the idea is that what we wanted to seek from that case is not only the holding of law enforcement accountable, but holding parole accountable for their duties. John Gardner was someone that was on everybody's radar. He was a convicted, violent sexual offender. He was on the registry. We know about him. That doesn't even count the hundreds of thousands of sex offenders who've never been reported, never registered, never been out there. Yet this person had 14 violations of parole where nothing was done. He even went in himself to a parole agent and said, I need help, I'm having urges, and he was turned away. And 2 weeks later, he killed Chelsea King. That was when he actually, 2 weeks prior to killing Chelsea King, he had gone and actually cried out for help on his own. As despicable of a human being as he has been quite helpful in providing information in the failures of the parole system. And it's time as a public that we get angry and that we don't let this stuff continue to happen, because until we not only start holding our voted officials, our government officials, and the people who have the power to do something accountable, these offenders will continuously abuse and assault victims in the world.
So when we talk about that, and these folks, I'm sure in some respects, and myself included, feel a little bit helpless, because it sounds like the system, which is so big and overwhelmed, what can we do to make a difference? Well, besides getting a hold of a politician and putting some pressure on them, is there anything that we can do to make it better?
Well, I think the first thing is to be aware. I think that we need to take an interest in these cases. There are not just the news-making cases, but you're going to hear cases about people, your friends, your colleagues, whatever in the circumstance. And what we can do is we can encourage them to report. And once a report is made, then you have a document that starts to begin the accountability process. And we can only hold the people who have the position of power accountable if we are accountable ourselves. You just can't bitch and complain about it unless you actually are willing to take that next step. And that next step is either reporting, it's letter writing, it's passing on the word, it's talking about it so that people are, and voting, frankly, going and making sure that the people that you want to, that have the ability to make the changes are actually the people in office and are the ones who are doing it. So you have a huge opportunity coming up. I'm not even a politician. I'm urging you to vote.
Right. Detective Reyes, I mean, you have dealt with this for many years. What are your frustrations when you hear cases like a John Gardner, and I'm sure you've seen some things personally on how the system does not work and you see innocent victims out there?
My frustrations are probably mostly with different parts of legislation and the way laws are written. In the parole case and sexual registrants, I know there's a lot of controversy right now because, take for instance, a sex offender can't live within 1,000 yards of a school or a park. Well, there's no penal code that law enforcement can enforce in any of our statutes. It's a parole issue. It's only dealt with or enforced by parole agents, and it's part of their parole conditions. So I think, it's things, when things slip through the cracks like that, that's what makes our job harder.
Has there been any improvement, at least in the situation, in your time as a detective?
Oh, yes, there has. I mean, legislation is always changing, and they're currently working to fix this problem. But, there's different aspects of penal code sections, you have different problems in prosecuting these cases. And I know in these type of crimes, when children are involved, you need some type of cooperation with these cases. And a lot of times, because they're children, there's only the adult perpetrator and the child. There are no witnesses. There's no, a lot of times there is no medical evidence, and the suspect or the offender will not admit it. So you have nothing to take into a courtroom and say, we're going to prosecute this person. So a lot of times these offenders go free.
Mm-hmm. We'll get to Dr. Berman in one second. I want to bring in Special Agent Mitchell, because since we're talking about law enforcement, you're basically dealing with almost a new kind of crime. Granted, we're a few years into it, but you're dealing with the internet, I imagine social media, stuff like that?
Absolutely.
And then how are things progressing in that area?
Well, I mean, with the advent of any new technology, the offenders that we investigate are going to exploit that technology to meet their needs. And so the difficulties that we have is keeping up on the technology ourselves, understanding what the capabilities are, understanding how it is that we can track someone that may be committing a crime against a child using that technology. I mean, for example, who knew 10, 15 years ago that we'd have iPhones that we could walk around with that had the capability of doing everything that we do at our home computer? That's created problems for us. We have individuals that are committing crimes using their iPhone as they're walking in and out of a Starbucks or walking in and out of an area that has wireless access. So it creates additional complications, but we work very hard in law enforcement to try to stay on top of those new technologies so that we can, be right behind the offenders as they're trying to commit the crimes.
And these offenders, and you specialize in children, right? Children who have been victimized. So these offenders are probably preying on the fact that children are naive, they're easy to convince of things, etc.
Absolutely, and they're also preying on the issue that children are going to be using the internet. I mean, I'm sure most of you that have children are doing research on the internet. They're online. They're out there. They want to communicate online with their friends, just like we did when we were young, using the telephone. After school, they're doing it in social networking websites and places like that. The offenders know that. The offenders are going to go where the children are. And so that further complicates our problems. But of course, we want the children to understand that the internet has great educational opportunities as well. So it's a tough balance.
Right.
Oh, can I just jump in?
Sure.
I think it's important. I think one thing I wouldn't want anyone to go, and I think very often people blame the medium. I mean, these are perpetrators who are just utilizing a different mechanism to do the things that they would already do, and it's a different means. And I think that as a society, that we want to blame the internet and then we punish our children. So a perpetrator comes and approaches our child online in some sort of instant message, and we say to our child, okay, don't go on Facebook anymore, or okay, don't do that anymore. So now we have punished our child for the actions of some other person, and our kids will then not come to us because they don't want to have their privileges taken away from them. So instead of blaming the technology and blaming the tool, we should honor our children and be appreciative of when they come to us and say, look at this person who came to us online, and say, I'm so proud of you for coming to me and telling me, and let's use this as a teachable moment and an opportunity to talk about it. And then say, okay, now that we've done this and I know that we've had this talk, we're going to delete this person, because that's the only way to respond to a perpetrator online is to delete, not engage in any communication. And then we let our kids go back online because they shouldn't be punished by the actions of other people.
It's a good time to bring in Dr. Berman to talk more about that, the victims, people who have been victimized, etc. What would you like to say about that?
Well, a few things, that it's so important that we empower our children, and that empowerment starts really early on. And there are a lot of things that we do in our culture that we don't even realize, that we send a message to our kids that they don't have the right to say no, that they shouldn't trust their gut instincts. Perfect example is you bring your child or your grandchild over to a friend's house or a relative's house that they're not that familiar with. Before you go, you say, kiss Uncle Bob, goodbye. And that child says, I don't want to. And we've been culturally conditioned to say, oh, don't be rude, kiss Uncle Bob. But it's a talk about a teachable moment. In that moment, what you're telling that child when you say, no, you have to kiss Uncle Bob, is don't listen to your instincts, and it's okay if you don't want to be touched, if you don't want to be physical or affectionate with someone who is older. Their authority is more important than your right to not be touched. And that is really one of those key moments. And so often, I can't tell you how many times I get calls in my radio show or parents in my private practice who are more concerned with not offending someone else than they are with protecting their child and empowering their child. And, taking it a few steps further, Gavin DeBecker in his book, The Gift of Fear, he's a security specialist, and he gives a great example of a woman who, she is walking into her apartment, and it's in New York, and it's a security building, and a man walks in behind her, and she has this gut feeling of like, I should let him walk in with me, but she lets him walk in. And
Again, it's back to what Jen and Robin had said. You really have to make sure your children know that they can trust you and that they can communicate with you, and when something is bothering them, you tell them, because in most of these cases, children do not disclose right away. It's always a delayed disclosure, and by that time, if there's any medical evidence, it's gone. Because the children just don't have that communication open with the parent. So in a lot of these cases, it's very common for children to have a delayed disclosure.
What if you're not the perpetrator, you're not the victim, you're somebody on the outside? Let's say you are the mother of a child who potentially could be victimized, and it's your husband and that child's stepfather. What are signs, I guess in your experience, that maybe that mother should be aware of and be looking at?
Any changes in behavior, any changes in normal behavior, whether it's in school, whether it's at home, anything that changes in your child's behavior is a key indicator.
Is there anything that you can catch before it actually happens? I know it's a tough question, Arma. Go ahead.
One of the key things is teaching your children language, and that starts really early. That starts in the first 3 years. Teaching your children to use the correct words for their genitals instead of pee-pee and wee-wee makes them a lot less vulnerable to perpetrators. There was actually a study, I believe it was at the American Academy of Pediatrics, that found that children who knew the proper names for their genitals were less likely to be victimized by perpetrators. And that's also important if, God forbid, something does happen, if they're in court, to be able to use that kind of language to describe what happened is really key to helping the child. But also, an early thing that we've done in our home, and this I've learned from Robin, and I've also learned from Patty Fitzgerald, who's another child safety expert, is my kids are only 4 years old, and so the rule in our house is we don't keep secrets. And if anybody comes to them and says, I have a secret, then they are supposed to tell me and their father, and they know they will not get in trouble. If anything, they will be rewarded. So, and we had a situation where two things happened. One is they have an ice skating teacher who they were playing with, and they were on the ice, and they were playing with some stuffed animals, and they said to her, "How do you have stuffed animals at your house?" And she was being playful, and she said, "Oh, I'll tell you a secret. I have some at my house." And I don't feel like she was doing something out of line, but I love that my kids came to me, and it was a few days later. It wasn't right away, it was delayed, but they said, "Oh yeah, so-and-so went during our ice skating lesson, said I have a secret," and I told her, "We don't keep secrets in our family, and we wanted you to know." And that's a great example of early on of a child understanding, because when perpetrators are grooming children, that's one of the first things that they do. Yeah, I have a secret, I want you to keep my secrets, and that's a great way for them to collaborate with the child and try to win that child over.
Robin, you had something?
Yeah, just in terms of language, before you get into a courtroom, if your kids are not using the right language, then we as adults may miss a report. If I had a case, may have been one of Detective Reyes' case at the time, but someone came in, it was a 5-year-old girl who used the Spanish word pan, which means bread, to describe her private part. And she made about 8 disclosures that daddy was touching her pan. And everyone thought that dad was touching the bread because no one had any clue that her word for her vagina was pan. So forget court. Right? You're talking about the opportunity to disclose. And so unless we're using the same vocabulary and speaking the same language, we may not even recognize, even professionals may not recognize a mandatory reporting opportunity, a time for any sort of action to be taken. In addition, just from the early warning signs, anyone who wants to hang out with kids, you gotta wonder about. I mean, do any of you want my 8-year-old tonight? I don't think so, right? Unless you're getting paid, unless that's your job. I don't want any of these people's kids in my house hanging out tonight. People, I mean, unless for my kids' benefit, right? Unless it's a play date. So anybody who has an over-interest in relating to children, who is willing to be able to spend and be able to relate to children in an unusual way, should at least pique your own instincts so that you can recognize that this isn't someone who should be around your child. And I think that it begins with us, in order to teach children how to be able to find their instinct, we need to be able to find our own instinct too. And that's how we begin the modeling. Yeah.
Special agent.
Go ahead. I just have something to add to that. These sexual predators also, you do have to trust your own instinct because they prey on single moms. So something to throw out there and think about. So really trust your own instinct and look at who you're bringing into the home.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And also, I think it's important to, and Dr. Jen, I'm sure could speak more on this, but pay attention to the development, especially with language of your child. If your child has never been taught in your household the words vagina and penis, and all of a sudden they're saying those words, or they're saying something about someone asking to see their pee-pee or their boobies or something like that, that should be an enormous red flag, that someone else outside of someone in your household has been discussing this type of content with them. We've had numerous cases where that's how the abuse has come forward, that someone has said, hey, my daughter today said something about her hoo-hoo, and she's never used that word to describe her vagina. I don't know where she got that word. And it turns out we find there's someone, you know, affiliated with the family or another family member who has been the perpetrator who taught her that word. So those are things to pay attention to.
Good point. I'm going to get to questions from the audience in 1 second, but Dr. Berman, since we're talking about victims, one thing you told me before this panel started was that people who are victimized are often repeatedly victimized in other situations. Explain that to me.
It's very common, I've seen all too many times in my practice, where someone is molested as a child and then going on off to college, or in other situations they are raped, or in other terrible situations where they're then victimized again. And Robin and I were talking about this as well, about how once that trust has been broken, and once that person has been victimized like that, they are only, unfortunately, more vulnerable. And it's key when a child or an adult has been victimized in any way to get therapy. I'm a big believer in going from victim to survivor, and that it's crucial to be empowered, because without that empowerment, you don't have the ability to say, I'm not comfortable with that, please take your hand off my leg, or anything else. That each time that a boundary is broken, especially once you get to college or even high school now, that it leaves that person more vulnerable. When I was at LaCaw, we did this great exercise where it was like an empowerment day, and we were doing self-defense, and a bunch of adult women were all sitting in a circle, and the person who was leading said, okay, I want for you to pretend like you're in a bar now, and you meet this really cute guy, and he's very interested in you, you really like him, and he puts his hand on your leg, but it makes you really uncomfortable. How do you ask him to take his hand off your leg? And in a room full of, I think it was like 50 women, strong, educated women, almost every woman had a difficult time figuring out how to ask that person to take their hand off the knee. And the person who was leading the group pointed out, each time you let someone violate your comfort zone, they are going to violate even more. They're going to take another step. And if it's a good person even, they don't know that they're violating your boundaries, and then you're in a very vulnerable position. And if it's not, then suddenly you become a victim.
Okay.
And just along those lines, victims make great victims. And if 86 to 92% of the cases, as the statistics show, are perpetrators who know the victim, they know that they've been victimized. So there's no better way than to find someone who's been victimized, and then be able to blame what you're doing as a perpetrator on somebody else's actions. Perpetrators are very skilled manipulators. They know, they have radar vision. They know how to find the weak person. They know how to find the person who's doing drugs. They know how to find the person, a kid who's cheated on their math test. They know those are the people that they look for, because they're the people that are perceived to be bad people, and therefore less likely to be trusted and believed if they're reported on. So that's another phenomenon in the re-victimization, because a lot of times perpetrators know that and take advantage of it.
I guess it's a self-esteem issue too. If you have a low self-esteem, then you're probably extremely vulnerable, because you're scared to kind of speak up for yourself.
And also, especially with kids, they oftentimes blame themselves. If only I had listened to what mommy said and I hadn't gone to that friend's house, if only I had A, B, and C, fill in the blank, because kids are egocentric developmentally. They almost always blame themselves, whether it's a divorce or they've been victimized. It's just developmentally how their brains work.
Wow. Okay, let's get to some questions here. This first one is fairly generic, but very important. It says, what advice would you give to teenage girls to protect themselves from sexual predators? And I imagine, especially that teenagers are especially vulnerable to online predators, etc., because they're on the internet, they're socializing so often.
Absolutely. I mean, as I mentioned before, I think one of the important things, Robin has mentioned a very good point, that the tool used by the predator is not something that we should be afraid of. It's something that we should use as a teaching opportunity with our kids. And just like you would not encourage your child to walk up to a perfect stranger in a park and start carrying on a conversation or something like that, they shouldn't be communicating with people that they don't personally know. The other thing that we see a lot, and I'm sure that Detective Reyes sees, is that teenagers tend to give too much personal information about themselves out on the internet. And what does that allow for? The vulnerabilities for the predator to prey on. If they put on there that they're on the soccer team, but they don't get played a lot when they're on the field for whatever reason, maybe they're not really good, that's something the predator can prey on and start a conversation about and use that to get closer and closer to the victim. So just making sure that that teens aren't putting a lot of information about themselves out there on the internet or anywhere, cell phones, wherever it may be.
Yeah, and can I add something? Also on that note, you should be monitoring your children's or your teenagers' Facebook, what they're putting out there. So another, comes back to good parenting skills, and you should know who they have as your friends, and you yourself should be their friend on their Facebook. That way you get everything that they get. That's another good thing I know. I have a teenage daughter, so that's what we did.
Yeah, my co-anchor has 2 teenage daughters, and I often see her monitoring their Facebook, and she always knows her password and stuff like that. Granted, she does it during the show sometimes, which gives me some good reading, but distracting at the same time.
And also Xbox too. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
Xbox, that's interesting.
Xbox, you can also talk to other people playing the same game you are and challenge them. And this is kind of like, I guess it's also like the internet. You can talk to different people who you don't even know. And we've had some cases come through where predators have gone after people playing, young children playing Xbox and have befriended them and groomed them while they're playing the same game.
That's interesting, because in Xbox, when you just hop online, you join a bunch of other players from all over the world. Each one are little people, and so you just hear them on the headset, but you don't really meet them. Stuff like that. That's something that I hadn't thought about.
One thing that Detective Reyes brought up that I would just encourage all parents to do is know the password for your child's online accounts. I can tell you from a law enforcement perspective, and I'm sure Detective Reyes will agree, that if your child goes missing, one of the first things we're going to be asking is your child on the internet? Who did they hang around with? If they're on the internet, we need to get into that internet account as soon as possible. Upwards of 70% of children are murdered within the first 3 hours that they're abducted, and if it's a teenager and they're online, we don't have time. Precious time is being wasted by us doing subpoena service and trying to get a hold of online providers. So if you happen to have the password for your child's account, that's very valuable to us as investigators.
That brings up another point. Oh, go ahead. Do you want to have some?
Yeah, and that's not enough. I mean, the passwords are helpful to give to law enforcement, but there's a much easier technique in terms of Facebook. They go up to go to the bathroom, you get your butt in front of that computer, and you pick up where they left off. The Fourth Amendment does not apply to children. I have given you permission to snoop. You pick up their phone, you read their texts. We have an opportunity to know more about our kids than any other generation of parent ever does. Our kids put their status and update what they're doing minute by minute for us. We know where they are, who they're with, who their friends are. We have a huge opportunity to connect with them in a way that we never have before because of the internet. So let's utilize the means that the predators do to get to know our kids, because the reason why predators are successful is they are willing to spend time. And that's what we don't do as parents. We are too busy multitasking and too busy. We want it quicker and faster and easier and just the answers, where the predators are willing to spend that extra 20 minutes to figure out the ins and outs of what our children are doing.
One thing I just want to jump in on the topic of respectful parenting. So when you buy that phone, you let that child know that this is my gift to you, but I will be checking your internet. We will be checking all your messages, and same thing with the computer. So it is not a surprise.
Correct.
Right. Don't let your kids convince you that you don't have a right to it. That you do have a right to it. This is a really tough one to talk about, but Adrian, you kind of mentioned it, and that is once an abduction takes place, the person is potentially dead in 3 hours. So I think, and we've done stories on this before, where I think the message is always Whenever you are told to get into the car, even with a weapon on you, do not do it, because more than likely your chances of dying have increased exponentially. Does anybody want to make a comment about that?
It's true.
All right.
I mean, the one thing, from a self-protection point of view, I was very involved in the Lily Burke case, which was the child at Oakwood. It was a friend of my stepson's. The case was very near and dear to my heart and really troubling, because this was an example of a case where we spent a lot of time and energy raising kids who are respectful, open-minded, and accepting to people. So I think we've defaulted the other way, to where we've taught kids to be so open and understanding and forgiving to other people that we have taught them to ignore their instincts and their judgments, because otherwise we're going to look racist, biased, gender biased, whatever type of thing. I think that there is a difference, and we need to make sure that we're having conversations about recognizing that it's okay to make judgments about people, and it's okay to have a safety plan. Having a safety plan isn't scary, it's responsible. We teach every kid what to do in an earthquake. We teach every kid what to do in a fire. But yet we say we're scaring the shit out of them if we tell them what to do if they're abducted.
Right.
So given the fact that there is that huge percentage of chance of lack of survival in a car situation, we need to teach our kids what to do when there's a car, to run, to buy time. This isn't about winning a fight, this is about getting away.
And surviving, right? Tough decisions to make sometimes, so sometimes you have to do what's going to keep you alive. Here's an interesting question, and we actually touched on this a little bit in our conversation before this started. What has changed society so much that every week we hear about children being molested? Streets and parks used to be safe for kids to play. Is that the reality, or is that just the perception and we're just learning more? I mean, any ideas, any thoughts on? It's true that we seem to hear about this a lot more than we used to.
I mean, it's hard to say. I think that one thing that has changed is that we're a more open society, so we talk about things that before nobody talked about. You know, before someone had cancer, you have cancer. But now, if someone's been molested, it makes the news, and it makes the newspapers, and people want to know about it, because people do want to try to know what they can do to keep their family safer. So I do think that there's more of a dialogue. So it's definitely out there more. You know, I know that I've read some studies. I know abductions have actually gone down, but I do think it does feel like, at least, that there are more cases of sexual abuse and molestation.
Well, and thanks to the news, we have and the internet, we have 24-hour access. So things that would not get reported by KABC because it wasn't newsworthy is on a blog, or is on someone's Facebook status as an event. So more and more information is disseminated, and we are more aware, which is helpful.
And okay, so this could lead to this next question from an audience member. What do you believe about neighbors posting information on the internet about predators in their area? And as I said at the very top of our discussion today, and there are websites available where you can actually find some of these registered sex offenders living in your neighborhood. So what do you guys think about neighbors posting information about offenders that might live near you?
All for it, as long as it's accurate.
Accuracy obviously is key.
I think it's great. I think it's a great way of, neighborhood safety, knowing what's going on in your own neighborhood, whether it's next door to you or down the block. Also, in the Halloween coming up in a couple of weeks, I think we need to be careful of where we send our kids to go get their treats. A lot of times these predators will decorate their house to entice kids to come to
that's a
the
good
door.
point. Yeah. Well, and this, just to throw this out there for further conversation, the same person who asked that question said, should these offenders be castrated and would it make a difference? I mean, we have discussed that in the media in the last few years about castration, but there seems to be a thought that that doesn't really make a difference.
I mean, the studies seem to show if they're not going to use their penis, they'll use their finger, they'll use their mouth, they'll use a weapon. So personally, someone who is intent on abusing will find whatever tool that they need to use to abuse.
We've had paraplegics that have committed these types of crimes, so I agree with Robin that it's not just the penis. There's other things that can happen that are just as abusive to a child that does not involve a penis. So I don't believe that would resolve the problem.
This could be helpful. Sorry, go ahead.
It's a nice idea.
Okay.
Yeah, but it feels good.
Detective Reyes and Robin Sachs both referred to the grooming done by perpetrators. Can they describe that process more, and what signs to look for when that's going on before things proceed any further?
Well, the grooming process really comes from, like say, in my case as a step-parent or a parent, where they'll favor one of the children over the others, let them have special treats that the other ones don't, or special time alone, or if you do this, I'm taking you here. Or if you're a single mom and someone's, you're dating, or they take a special interest in your child, and they say things to children depending on their age, what sounds good to a child, what they want to hear. And I know in one case that Robin and I had, was a teenage girl, and she came from a broken home, and this predator told her that he was going to take care of her. She had no one in her home that took care of her. He told her that he would drive her to school, and he would get her hair done and get her nails done and buy her new clothes, and he would be his girl. Well, this all sounded great to this girl, and so she got in the car.
Well, and grooming, just by definition, is the process by which a perpetrator utilizes to be able to gain access and trust by a victim. It's not a tool that is limited to just the actual victim themselves. It's a skill that they use to break down barriers, to make you question your instincts, and to gain the access and the trust, not just with the victim directly, but a skilled perpetrator will groom various members, not just the targeted victim, but the targeted victim's family as well. So that way, and this is very common, say, in the teacher-student situation, where the teacher will spend time working on gaining the trust with both the parent and the child. So that way, when the child is starting to question their instincts, they go home and say, oh, Mr. So-and-so did this. Mom will already be saying, Mr. So-and-so is wonderful. I love that teacher. It's so nice that he's willing to spend an extra time with you on your math. It's really helping your grades. And so what you have is the words out of the parents supporting the position of the perpetrator, making it thereby much more difficult for the victim to be willing to disclose. And part of that also with kids is it's very confusing when it comes to sexual assault with kids, because sexual assault doesn't necessarily hurt. It doesn't necessarily feel bad. Boys may get an erection. Girls may find vaginal moistness and find sexual pleasure out of it. So it's very confusing that something that may actually feel good to the body be something that's bad. And it's very hard. Many studies will show that the trauma isn't recognized until many, many, many years after the abuse took place. And for many, many years, a child will never even look at themselves as a victim.
Another question here is, you spoke a lot about child victims. What are signs of sexual predators with adults? Any thoughts?
You mean in terms of grooming or in terms of...
I think in terms of just being victimized by as an adult as opposed to as a child. And what are signs that you might gain that the person you are, I guess, interacting with is a sexual predator?
So let me just be clear. So you're asking first, what are the signs like a friend of yours has been assaulted?
Or maybe looking at you as a potential victim. I know we kind of touched a little bit on that with the groceries and stuff like that.
Well, I do think that the key is looking at someone who does not respect your boundaries. I mean, that's really such an early sign. And someone who, when you say, I'm not comfortable with that, still is pushing the envelope, because the truth is it's somebody that cares about you, actually wants you to have a good experience being with them, and doesn't want to feel like they're pushing themselves on you, whether it be sexually or even in terms of friendship.
Well, and also spousal rape. A lot of people don't even think that it's possible for a spouse to rape another because it's some sort of entitlement to be able to have sex with your spouse. The fact of the matter is that sex is a consensual act between both parties, and whether or not we call it domestic violence or abuse, if it has to do with sex, it still could be a rape, whether it's a spouse or not. And I think the same vulnerabilities that we look at with children that apply to adults. Adults who are drug users, who may have their own vulnerabilities. Adults who've gone through their own issues, who may be likely to succumb to the charm of another person. Anybody who's vulnerable for any other condition is likely to be vulnerable to be a victim of sexual assault as well.
There's a number of questions here that all kind of pertain to the same topic, and that is, can a sexual predator be cured One person wanted us to talk more about incarceration. Does this really work, keeping them incarcerated? Are there any effective ways that we have come up with that actually helps, I guess, a sexual predator stop being a predator? Have we seen anything like that? And what do we do about these predators? Is there any way to rehabilitate them?
I focus more on the victim side, but one thing that I could say is that I wouldn't take a chance with my kids, I wouldn't take a chance with myself, and that most predators, or pretty much all that I know of, once they have that urge, even if they're able to suppress that urge, they still have that urge.
Right, and from my experience, it also depends on what kinds of sexual predator there are. There's different psychological analysis of what type of predators someone may be. So someone who is truly a pedophile will always be a pedophile, in my opinion. However, there are circumstances in which people get classified as maybe sexual offenders in a situation where they may not. For example, the case of the 19-year-old who maybe had sex with a 17-year-old, but yet the 17-year-old mother couldn't really figure out how to parent their own 17-year-olds, who decided to call the cops and get the cops involved, and now you have a 19-year-old who's in the criminal justice system as a sexual offender who's not really a sexual offender. So I think it's very important not to clump all offenders in the same category and leave it to the offender people to make sure that they deal with them.
Special Agent Mitchell, what is the difference between what the FBI does and, let's say, what somebody like Detective Reyes would do on a local standpoint? And if you have your suspicions, when does somebody contact the FBI as opposed to the local police department?
Well, I think the most important thing is that if you have suspicions, that you contact law enforcement. Who you contact means nothing to us. I mean, the most important thing that we're trying to emphasize today is just report the information, be aware and report. The FBI becomes involved in investigations when it affects interstate commerce. And that can mean numerous things, and I won't go into the nitty-gritty legal definition of all of that, but generally speaking, the types of child exploitation cases that we see involve an adult who has traveled across state lines, maybe met a child on the internet, communicated with them, and traveled across state lines in order to abuse that child, or crimes involving child pornography, so an individual who has taken photographs of a child and posted them on the internet and is sharing them with others. That's generally when we become involved, but because we're a task force and we have local and state law enforcement officers on our team, oftentimes we also get cases like Detective Reyes does that starts with a hands-on abuse case and may also progress to, in the investigation we learn that there's child pornography, which is something that we can prosecute in the federal system.
Let's put it this way. If there's a lot of really good evidence, give it to the feds. If it's a really hard case, give it to LAPD. Sorry.
When it comes to child pornography, how pervasive of a problem is that? And how difficult is that to track down?
Well, I mean, the problem with any image that is on the internet is we're never getting it back. If you post an image on the internet, there's no delete button where you can wipe an image off of the internet forever and ever. And the same holds true for child pornography. So when you're the way I like to look at it is from a victim perspective. A victim is trying to, as Dr. Jen said, move into the role of survivor. But yet that victim knows that that image of child pornography that was taken of them when they were 7 years old is on the internet for the rest of their lives, and that someone might run across it. I mean, we could devote 100 law enforcement officers to this problem, and we would only be scratching the surface of a problem of child pornography.
Can I say one thing
Sure.
about child pornography? Child pornography are crime scene photos. A lot of people say, oh, I just utilize child pornography for my own personal stimulation. No, those child pornography pictures are pictures of sexual assaults against children and should be treated as such.
This question here, it says, I am a mother of a 5-year-old daughter and an 8-month-old son. What can I do at home to protect my children from predators? What do I say, teach, practice at home that will stop them from being victimized?
I think once again it goes back to teaching the proper words for genitals, penis, vagina, also being respect from the beginning when you're diapering that child and you're putting on the diaper. Okay, now I'm going to put on, now I'm gonna wipe your penis, now I'm gonna clean you, now I'm gonna put on some Desitin, all that sort of stuff. That's really the very early stages of teaching respect about your child and their body, and also teaching them that they're the boss of their body, that nobody else should be touching them in the bathing suit area, except for mom or dad to clean them. Even if a doctor asks, if they are with a doctor, that a parent should be in the room. I actually ended up leaving a pediatrician that I was with because I was in the room and he didn't ask my child during an exam, opened a diaper and just examined her genitals, and I wasn't comfortable with that. I'm now with a doctor who asked. I have 2 kids. One kid, he asked for permission, said, now I'd like to examine your vagina. Your parents are in the room. I'm going to ask them, is it okay? And I said, it's okay with me. It's okay with her. And he said, I want to ask you too. And she said, no. He said, okay. And he said, at any time a child says no, that's the boundary I respect. And it's really important as parents that we respect that as well.
Can I ask something?
Can I ask you a question though about
Yeah.
that? But what happens if you have to get my daughter doesn't want to have her, her vagina looked at either, and
Yeah.
she'll always say no. At what point do you say, but this needs to happen?
If there's something wrong, if she's having a physical ailment, that's when I would push it. And then I would give her acceptable options. And I would say, you can have it examined by the male doctor or the female doctor. Do you want me to hold your hand, or do you want me to turn my back during the exam? Then I would give acceptable options so that she gets the power back. But if there's nothing wrong and she says no, I would respect it.
And I disagree. I think that in a regular examination, because a lot of things without early warning, there may not be a sign, and I would want my doctor to, as the experienced doctor, to look at everything, and I would say to my child in advance, you're going to have your body looked at by the doctor, and you're going to have your inside of your ears, and you're going to have your inside of your nose, and you're going to have the inside of your throat, you're going to have the inside of your tushy, you're going to have the inside of your vagina, and that's what's going to happen today. But let's make sure that the doctor tells us all of the things that they're going to look at beforehand.
That works for me too.
Good points though, on
And then
both
on
sides.
top of that, also, you need to know who your children are with. If you have daycare, or if you have a babysitter or a nanny, you need to know, and it's in their home, or you need to know who else has access to that home. You need to know if they have a son, an uncle, a boyfriend that's going to be coming over. You need to make sure you know who's coming over and who's going to have access to your kid.
And that goes for play dates as well. A lot of the times parents are afraid to ask the difficult questions. Is there a gun in the house? Where do you store your medication? That kind of stuff. And it's also important to ask who else is going to be in the house. And sometimes people don't even think about, oh yeah, well it's just me. But it turns out that the plumber came over and was fixing the plumbing. Well, that's something I want to know as a parent, and that's a question that I'm going to ask.
One question here, how vulnerable are boys to sexual predators? Anybody want to comment on that?
Very vulnerable. And I think they're particularly vulnerable because the society tends to assume that it's always the girls, that the girls are the victims, but boys are victims. I would say, Robbie, you could speak to statistics better than I could, but they're probably just as much, but it's so much more underreported.
It's underreported because there's a great deal of shame that a boy, particularly a teenage boy, wasn't able to fight it off, stand up for themselves, especially if there is sometimes the impression that they start to wonder and question their own sexuality. If in fact that they were the perpetrator was someone of the same sex, they wonder if does that mean that they're gay, that they're not gay? Does that mean, what does it all mean? So what we need to do is treat body safety and body issues with the same importance for boys as we do for girls.
I would completely agree. I mean, we've had numerous cases involving boys as victims, and they've said, I didn't tell anyone initially because I didn't want someone to think I was gay when it involved an adult male perpetrator. And it's important that we recognize that, especially when we're raising our kids, that information should be shared with parents regardless of what you think that we'll think about it, how you perceive that we will believe you are, whether it's your sexual identity or whatever the case may be. But that's a huge problem that we've seen with boys who have said, I didn't tell anyone, I didn't want you to think that I was homosexual. I'm not. I like girls. I like girls. And that doesn't matter to us as investigators, and it certainly shouldn't matter to us as parents.
The term registered sex offender includes both hardened career criminals and those who may have had sex with their underage girlfriend when they're 18. Is there any effort to distinguish between these types of registered sex offenders? Any comments on that?
Well, the registered sex offender list has the crime for which the person was convicted. So that information is already available, and the registry in and of itself is meaningless without looking at the information in it. So when you are looking at registries, you should look at what the person was convicted of, because the person who has a history or a conviction for an adult sexual assault crime is at a different risk, or a different person is at risk than someone who has been convicted of child sexual assault. So the registry says the name of the person, has the address of the person updated with a picture that's handy, but it also includes the offense by which they were convicted that caused the registration. I can tell you that there is no registration requirement in the state of California for an 18-year-old and a 16-year-old for an unlawful sex, basically a statutory rape situation that is not a registrable offense in the state of California. So the perception that those are the people that are on the registries is wrong. The crimes for which people are registered for are for violent sex offenses or for sex crimes against minors under the age of 14.
So that's a misconception then, is that if you're on there for statutory rape and you're, let's say, 18 and you had sex with your 15-year-old girlfriend, you're not going to go on that list.
Correct.
Okay. We've covered this.
Unless it was a rape. But
Right.
that's not so, but
That's different.
that's a violent crime.
Right. We've covered this, but it bears repeating and maybe in a little more detail. Is it true that most perpetrators are within the victim's family or close friends of the family? True?
That is true. It's mostly, and I think Adrian had said something about the statistics, was that they're mostly someone that you know, it's an acquaintance, whether it's adult or a child.
Okay. And then, again, we've talked about what to look out for clues, but I think the most important point is a vast majority, I think it's 90% in children and 80% in adults of people that you know that victimize or are sexual predators, at least. This question says, Detective Reyes, what can be done to change the legislation you mentioned that only parole department can enforce it?
Well, actually, they're working on that right now, and I don't have exactly what they're working on right now, but I know that there's meetings set up as we speak to kind of change this and kind of add something to our local law enforcement to give them a tool to go ahead and help enforce this right now.
And there's agency, there's a bunch of different local and national sexual assault agencies that talk about assembly bills and Senate bills that are pending, and bills that are being encouraged to be passed, tightening up the sex registry being one of them, and also fixing this loophole is another one. You can look on RAINN, which is on the RAINN.org, which is a Washington, D.C. based rape, assault, incest, something network, and and then missing and exploited children, which is the missing.org, also has a lot of legislation, and there are many other resources through the Department of Justice that will talk about those bills that are pending.
But please don't let this dissuade you from reporting a sexual registrant that you know of, or someone that may be living close to a school in violation of this, because we do have a team of officers that are dedicated to sexual registrants, and they will call, if you do report it, they will call that parole agency and let them know what's going on. So we will take action.
Now, this question regards teachers, and I know that there's a process to screen teachers, but we often see they do fall through the cracks. We do stories on this seemingly every week, how we don't understand how this happened, but a teacher is a sex offender. So what can you do when a teacher was a convicted sex offender? How can you protect your children when the school lacked the responsibility to do extensive background checks? Any thoughts? Anybody? Tough one, I know.
It's the same as with every other protection. You know, it's every other every type of safety tool you're using for any other perpetrator would apply for a teacher. But I think that the best tool that you have as parents is to make sure all the other parents know. Because one thing that where outrage really seems to work are in the schools, and if you can get enough pissed off parents at a PTA meeting, maybe you can get the teacher removed.
That's if you know. You know, you have to know the teacher's a sex offender, but what if you don't and you're just curious, you want to look up, do you just look at, you know, the Department of Justice?
Trust your gut.
Yeah.
Right, I mean, it doesn't,
Do the research.
right, they're unlikely, I mean, to be a sex offender. It's less likely to have an actual convicted sex offender teacher because of the background checks. That's not very likely, but what is much more likely is the unconvicted, unreported serial sex offender who is never have a single report on them, but yet has been using the classroom as their sex playground for a course of many years. And I actually prosecuted the case of Thomas Beltran, who was the 30-year teacher at Lincoln Middle School, who basically touched every single girl in his class. And that was an example of a case he was never convicted before until my case.
And when it comes to these like the Justice Department website that talks about the sex offenders in California, is there a clearinghouse nationally? Like, what if your teacher came from, you know, Rhode Island to work here in California and might be on a list? Is there such a thing as being a list over there and not being on a list over here? Does anybody know?
Well, that's actually one of the big downfalls in the system, is that because of it, anyone who's involved in schools, any teacher that has moved from school to school should be a red flag, as particularly moved from state to state. If someone on their resume has 10 different schools over the course of a short period of time, that should be a red flag of why is it that this person keeps being asked to leave, or why is this person not here? So there's no clearinghouse necessarily, but it's, again, utilizing your instincts and getting the answers of why is this behavior, the behavior of this teacher, is there a reasonable explanation?
Mm-hmm.
Also, it goes back to talking to your kid and asking them about their teachers, and you yourself going to meet their teachers. And if you have this gut instinct about this teacher, then follow that gut instinct.
Is it true that the vast majority of sexual predators are men? I mean, clearly the answer to that is yes, but women are sexual predators as well. Is that correct?
There have been very few cases.
Very few.
Very few cases where there are women.
But they're there.
But they're there, and they're usually, and Adrian and I had talked about this, they're usually, they work with they're co-abusers with the male, or, you know, it's a drug use type of issue.
Okay. Have you heard verbal?
Can I just say one thing? I also think as a society, we let women off the hook. When we hear about a female teacher having sex with a young boy, everybody high fives and says, I wish I was that boy. Where was that teacher when I was in high school? And we don't call that person a pedophile. We call her a cougar. We think she's hot. We have her booking photos look like a Vogue photo shoot. So I think as a society, we laugh, rightfully so sometimes, but it's not laughable because these perpetrators get away with it at greater length and have the ability to do much more damage and have many more victims before that gets reported.
Quickly here, because this is, we've touched on some of these, but have you heard verbal clues in interviewing predators that indicate sociopathic or other behavior that would let that person use and hurt a child? I mean, is there a way that a predator talks what that person says that gives us a clue? I mean, that's just a question. There may not be an answer. Go ahead.
A question like a clue is to hurt a child in the future, or?
Yeah, I think what they're trying to get to is there a way or things that a predator says or talks about that might give us some clue that that person's a predator?
Well, I know that there have been some studies on sexual predators where they say that they were victimized as a child. And, you know, there was one study where 70% of the men interviewed in prison said they were victimized as a child. Well, when they were polygraphed on these statistics, it dropped to less than 30%. So really, they're rationalizing to themselves about why they're, you know, a predator, or they want the sympathy from the public. So usually, they're not. They're really not a victim of sexual abuse. It's just something that starts. You know, I can't really say where it starts, but it's something inside of them that makes them
want to abuse children or have these sexual urges.
And then, as we mentioned earlier, that they've become really adept at being convincing. They're almost like cons. They find a way to lure you in and fool you and hide what they're really about. So you've got to be aware of that.
I think it's important to emphasize, Robin mentioned this before, but I think there is sometimes a misperception that these sexual predators just, they have these urges and they happen upon a kid. The amount of time that these offenders spend grooming parents, grooming families, grooming children, spend online researching people is extraordinary. I mean, we have gone into houses, and I'm sure Detective Reyes could say the same thing, where offenders have not left their computer and the food is near the computer. They have bottles that they've been urinating in because they can't stand to get away from whether it be their child pornography or communicating with minors online. They will spend an exorbitant amount of time in order to gain access to children. And no matter, whether they're, what they say is maybe not as important sometimes as what they're doing. Like, the adult male who wants to spend extra time with your kid is volunteering to babysit, like Robin said earlier, volunteering to take them to Magic Mountain, volunteering to do everything, and there's seemingly no reason why this man would want to be a part of your family. Big red flags.
Right. The one who's always there in the nick of time, just at that time. Oh, I'm here to come in that pinch. Like, you gotta wonder about that.
We haven't talked about this specifically, although obviously everything overlaps here. Background checking of caregivers. I guess, are there agencies that people can, talk to?
Robin wrote a great sidebar in my book, Super Baby 12 Ways to Give Your Child a Head Start in the First of Years, because I went to her with all these questions as well, because it's so hard to know as a parent. I mean, here there's Trust Line in California, and also there's nationwide registries when it comes to sex offenders. But that's Robin.
Yes. Your poor voice. I just wanted to give you some tea right now. I feel like we're abusing you. In any case, yes, it is a crime not to background check any caregiver in your home. I think as a mom too, I have two teenage, well now actually a college age and teenage and an 8-year-old. Caregiving and caregivers is the most difficult part of being a working parent and making sure that your kids are safe. And not only are there services that do it, but you need, when you're interviewing someone, you must get references. And beyond just getting the references, you need to call the references. You need to find out what the circumstances were like in the homes before that the person may have worked at, what the motivations are for working in your family, what kind of relationship, and asking some of the pointed hard questions. What would you do in this situation? What would you do in that situation? If your instinct gives you an icky feeling in the interview, you don't even need to bother doing the background check. You're not hiring that person. But when you get on to the next people, then you do background, that you get a copy of your driver's license. And I can't tell you how many times where you just say to them, I want you to know I'm going to run your criminal, I'm going to run your driver's license, and all of a sudden, well, I should probably tell you, there was this little shoplifting thing, and blah, 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 blah. And by the way, the forthcomingness of bad history could be a sign that that's actually a very trustworthy, good person. Someone who comes to you and says, listen, I'm going to just tell you who I am. I'm great with kids. I had a terrible judgment call when I was in college. I went into JCPenney and I stole a shirt, and you're going to see that on my record. I'm really embarrassed about it. And you find that, and that's a sign of someone who is honest and forthcoming. It doesn't mean that just because you've had bad choices, you're a bad person.
And also, in my other book, The A to Z Guide to Raising Happy Competent Kids, I have a whole list of interview questions to ask nannies. And I also talked about, and once again, Gavin DeBecker talks about it in his book, Protecting the Gift. He talks about doing secondary reference checks. So let's say if you go through an agency and the agency says, oh yeah, we already checked the reference. Like Robin said, always check yourself, call yourself. Make mistakes when you call. Like let's say it says on the resume, I took care of twins, Billy and Bobby, 2 boys for 3 years. And they're 4 years old. So you call up and then you say, so I understand you took care of Billy and Tim. Yeah, to Billy and Tim. And if it's a fake reference, they're likely to just go along with what you're saying. Whereas if it's a real reference, they no, it's Billy and Bob. You say, oh well, and they're 4 years. They're 4 years old. No, they're 3. So you want to kind of play dumb. You want to be a little bit of a Columbo. You remember that show from the 70s? And kind of play dumb and look for mistakes. And also, it's always a great idea to ask for that secondary reference. You know, so-and-so worked with you or for you for 5 years. Did you ever meet her husband? Is there anyone who you came across who I might be able to call to get another reference for? And some of the time, that person will know someone else. Oh yeah, you know what? She babysat for my neighbor. Let me give you her number as well. I'm sure she'll have great things to say.
And then once you've hired your caretaker, what do you look for then? Does everybody need a nanny cam?
You should always spot check. You should come home unannounced. I'm a big fan of ringing the door myself. One is you can see how your kid's going to do with answering the door. Number two, how far is your nanny from your kid from the front door? Are they upstairs while your kid's downstairs? Come home at times that you say that you're gone and you're scheduled for. Just like, I think people perform better when they think that they're being watched, and if you want them to think that they're always going to be watched.
Huh. That's a good point.
And also let your friends know that they ever observed something, to let you know. I had a client who got a phone call from a friend who observed their nanny in the park with their kid, and this was an incident where the nanny was talking on the cell phone the whole time and completely wasn't paying attention. Her kid fell on the floor, and the nanny didn't even budge from her phone conversation. And that's important. Always, if someone calls you with that kind of information, thank them for it. Don't get angry at them, thank them for it.
Okay. We're about done here, but I wanted to give each panelist an opportunity to maybe do a closing remark, just a few seconds or so. You want to start us out?
I think first of all, the best thing is that this room is nearly full, and that's what I think all of us up here like to see is, when we show up to do internet safety or talks on sexual predators, and there's 3 people in the audience, we're wondering about the children that the parents aren't here, like what's happening with them. So I'm happy to see that there are so many people that are here today, and just know that from a law enforcement perspective, we are doing what we can. And I encourage you to write legislators about changes in laws and things like that. If you see loopholes and if you see gaps when you're listening to media reports and you're listening to other commentators speak, get involved in it, because that's the only way that these things are going to change, is if we as a community come together and be the voice to go to legislators and explain, we are not going to allow these people to prey on our children.
Okay. Rob?
Well, I ditto all of those comments. I think the things that we need to recognize is that sexual assault is a crime that is not just the act, but it is a crime that occurs over the course of a relationship. And so the scene of the crime is not just the rape or the penetration or the touch, but it's all of the behaviors that led up to that day, and it is all of the behaviors that go on after that. And so we can't, I think that a lot of us focus on whatever the crime may be without giving and paying much attention or respect to the things that made that crime possible or happen, and the things that we need to do to prevent it afterwards.
Detective?
And always make sure you have open communication with your child. Make sure that they know that you want to hear from them. You want to hear everything they have to say, and you won't punish them for what they come to you with. And also always be aware and look out for other children in your neighborhood too. Be the Mrs. Kravitz of your neighborhood.
Doctor?
I would say empower your kids, trust your gut, and share the information that you learned here today with anyone who you know who has kids.
Great. Panelists, thank you very much. You guys were great.
For absolutely amazing moderation job, and the panelists, thank you also. I would like to remind you, for those of you who don't know, that we here at Council House do provide specialized treatment for abuse survivors. One of the things that we do here, which is so wonderful, is we have a Women Helping Women Talk line, we have counseling here. So if you know someone, if you need help, please seek us out. We would love to see you. Please fill out the evaluations. Thank you so much for coming, and hopefully we'll see you in November when we have our November event.